Good evening, everybody. My name is Jerry Burke. I'll be hosting this meeting. Welcome to the Jackson-Josephine County of the Small Woodlands Association Zoom meeting. The format of this meeting, Mike will speak to us for about an hour and then answer questions for the last 30 minutes or so. If you have any questions, you're welcome to write a chat, and then I'll get that, and we'll answer those questions after a little bit. So I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker, and then Mike can start. Presenter Dr. Mike Amaranthus is a retired research soil scientist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and associate adjunct professor at Oregon State University. He was the recipient of the USDA Highest Honors Award for Scientific Achievement and has several mushrooms and truffles named in his honor. He was the founder of Mycorrhizal Applications Incorporated, a world leader in the research and production of mycorrhizal inoculum. He is currently president of Myco Analytics LLC in Grants Pass, Oregon. Without further ado, go ahead, Mike.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share some information about what's going on beneath the grounds of your woodlands. Happy to answer any questions you might have at the end, or I don't know, Jerry, can we take questions during that?
We could. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just pause if you like, and I'll let you know what we've got.
Okay, sounds good. Anyway, we're going to talk about the secret beneath your feet. What's going on in the soils of the woodlands of Southwest Oregon. And I know that because of COVID, people spend a lot of time at home with their kids, et cetera, and having raised 5 kids and having 6 grandkids, I'm gonna go back one here. I know you're really enjoying your time at home. It's been interesting times. We spend a lot of time outdoors, which is good, but some of the indoor stuff has been challenging. So we're going to talk about what's going on beneath the soil surface of trees. In this particular slide, you can see a small pine tree grown in a glass box. And the only part of this tree that is the root is the central area here, where the woody part is. And the rest of these elongated filaments are actually the mycorrhizal fungi. So they play a huge role in the forests of Southwest Oregon. We're blessed to have a broad diversity of fungi in Southwest Oregon and very mycorrhizal dependent plants. Okay. And this dichotomous pattern that you saw on that seedling grown in the glass box is a artifact of a lot of natural processes that go on in our world, whether you look at the close-up of a small leaf or the blood vessels of the human heart or the river network of the Amazon. They have this dichotomous branching pattern. And that's the pattern that nature uses to access, absorb, and transport materials back to a particular location. So the mycorrhizal network is really much like so many networks that we have in nature for absorbing and transporting and delivering products. The mycorrhizal relationship goes way back, 460 million years. It goes back to the evolution of land plants. In fact, the first plants that successfully colonized the Earth's surface had a fortuitous marriage of both plant and fungus, which allowed these aquatic plants, which didn't have a root system, to colonize the harsh soil surface 460 million years ago. So many of the scientific community believe that it was the marriage of fungus and plants that allowed plants to colonize the Earth before they were just left to aquatic areas. Most typical people, I've been doing mycorrhizal fungi for 44 years, but especially 2 or 3 decades ago, people thought of fungi in a very negative fashion, mycophobic. And, fungus was something you got between your toes, something to destroy, something to fumigate, something to kill. And there are many fungi that are pathogens, especially in woodlands. We've got Phytophthora, Phalaenus, Armillaria. We have some powerful pathogens that are fungi, but we also have a whole group of fungi that are very beneficial for forest trees called the mycorrhizal fungi. So I'm going to have a little soil brain teaser here and ask true and false questions. I won't be able to hear your answers, but do you think it's true or false that there's 100 pounds of mycorrhizal mycelium for every human on the planet? True or false? It's actually false. There's 1,000 pounds of mycorrhizal mycelium for every human on the planet. So do you think, true or false, that 50% of the world's species live underground? That's also false. 90% of the world's species live underground. There are 1,000 species in a teaspoon of healthy forest soil. That is also false, because there's 10,000 species in a teaspoon of healthy soil. And do you think that a mycorrhizal colonized tree or plant increases the absorbing area of the plant root system 10 times? No, it's more like 100 to 1,000 times. So they're all false. But you can get an idea of the enormity of the role that the below ground ecosystem plays in plant systems. There's this great quote from Leonardo da Vinci: "We know more about the celestial bodies in the soil than the soil. We know more about the celestial bodies than the soil beneath our feet." And so it's this vast universe beneath the ground that influence so many of the Earth's ecological and ecosystem processes. And the mycorrhizal fungi are particularly helpful for absorbing nutrients in water for tree growth. Doesn't like going forward there. So like I said before, the relationship between mycorrhizal fungi and plants goes back 460 million years. And there's really a lot. It's probably the most researched part of soil biology. There's over 100,000 published studies. Southern Oregon was sort of the leader in a lot of the reforestation, tree growth studies. A lot of that work was started in the early 80s. And a lot of mycorrhizal field trials that I was fortunate enough to participate in a long time ago. Mycorrhiza literally means fungus root, myco, fungus, and rhiza root. It's a term that goes back to 1889. And the literature has documented that the mycorrhizal relationship with trees increases the uptake of nutrients, the amount of photosynthesis that goes on, so growth of the plant, disease resistance. It's very good at maintaining nutrients on site, so fertilizer and nutrients aren't lost, and allows the plant to survive a variety of stresses such as salt and drought. I'm not going to bore you too much with the technology of the different types of mycorrhiza, but I do want you to understand just some of the basics. Our areas and most of the Earth's ecosystems are dominated by ecto and endomycorrhiza. Approximately 80 to 90% of the world's plant families are dominated by those two. And I'll explain the difference. The ecto is here on the top. You can see, if you've ever dug around in the dirt in your woodlands, you've seen these threads. And some of those are saprophytic fungi that are decomposing organic matter. But in many cases, they're mycorrhizal fungi, which are actually absorbing nutrients and are basically the roots on the roots of your trees. And there are two types, the ecto, and they're kind of swollen. You can see the swollen roots, and the endo, which are a lot more subtle, require a hand lens or a microscope to view. If you look at a cross section of a root, okay, the fungal material in this cross section of a Douglas fir root is the fungus material is actually blue. And it's called ecto because it kind of forms a mantle or a covering or a sock-like protrusion around the root, and then penetrates into the outer cortical cells of the root. And in some root systems, there's more fungus than there actually is root, forming that swollen root. Here you can see the mantle on an oak root, sort of a sock-like covering that penetrates into the outer cortical cells. And if you look at it when you're digging in the soil, you'll see white or brown. They almost look like little coral reef patterns in your soil. And so here's the kind of the whole relationship where you've got, in this case, the root of a Douglas fir. Then you can see all the mycorrhiza. And the mycorrhiza produces a fruit, much like an apple tree produces an apple. In this case, it's a truffle, Hysterangium, very common to our area. But so you've got the plant, and you've got the mycorrhiza here, which is the fungus root. And then you got the fungus growing out in the soil. And then the fungus wants to produce a fruiting body to spread the seeds or the spores of the mycorrhiza. In this case, it's a truffle. So you can see the whole dynamic relationship there. So endomycorrhiza are more like, on incense cedars, maples, redwoods. A lot of the understory species are endo, and they don't form that mantle. They form, instead of that, they form like structures inside the root, and so they don't form fruiting bodies like mushrooms, truffles, or puffballs. Instead, they form individual spores in the root, and they don't cause the root to actually swell. What we did early in our career is to identify which tree species formed which kind of mycorrhiza. So we knew how to inoculate them at nurseries so they would perform better in nurseries. So we did a lot of that early research. And so we would collect the spores, which are basically the seeds of the fungus. And this is JJSWA. So we would collect these spores and we would actually water them into the young growing plants, so the roots would form mycorrhiza. This is a cross section of a root of an endomycorrhiza plant. You can see the spores bursting out of the roots of the plant. So we would actually grow these things specifically so they could produce these little seeds of the mycorrhiza, so we could use them in reforestation. So the mycorrhiza really has two basic functions. It has this exploratory phase here where the fungus is putting out threads in the soil, looking for water and nutrients to bring back to the plant itself, to the tree itself. And then it has this spore production phase. You can see the hyphae here, see the spore being produced, where they actually produce the seeds to spread the fungus across the forest. There are other types, I won't get into them, but there's some types that form with ericoid plants like heather. In our case, it's Southern Oregon, it's primarily blueberries, cranberries, blackberries form ericoid mycorrhiza, and then orchids. The orchids that you see in the forest form a special type of mycorrhiza. Madrone and manzanita form an ericoid type, but it really looks more like an ectotype when you actually see it in the field. But some of these, take these roots in cross section, it's amazing how much these roots are dominated by fungus. So the blue, this is actually a Douglas fir root again, but you can see, and you cut it in cross section and you stain the fungus blue, the root that's more plant, it's actually more fungus than plant. It's very much a fungal plant system. And then we've looked at these roots and looked at the mycelium. So these threads you see in the soil look like a little spider web are actually the World Wide Web. So this is the reason why nutrients and water doesn't escape from our forest, that it's able to be captured and absorbed by the plant, because it's a web that allows the soil to capture essential nutrients. And you think about like the drought that we're in right now, and it's crazy how these trees are surviving. I mean, they have so many needs for for water and nutrients that, because the soils are so dry, it's really hard for them to supply that to the tree. And without these fungi, which are really adapted to drought, poor nutrient conditions, our forests would all be dead right now. This is a glass box where you can see the difference between a tree without mycorrhiza and a tree with. It's obviously an evolutionary adaptation for the tree to be able to form this relationship with plants so it can better utilize the resources in the soil. So I've been doing this for a long time. I'm like kind of an old geezer. I first got interested in mycorrhiza back in the late 70s. Yeah, it's been a long time. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out which fungi went with which trees, and how best to inoculate trees and how to monitor their growth. And we learned a lot along the way. Or back then it was we didn't really know much. So this is Lacaria, which you probably have seen in your stands. I don't know what the common name is for Lacaria, but it's kind of a lilac colored, sometimes orangey lilac colored. They're very common, especially in pine stands. And you can actually use the spores that form underneath the caps here and use that as an inoculant for tree growth. And in this case, the mushroom grew bigger than the tree. So, I mean, the big question in terms of management of mycorrhiza fungi is, do you have them? And when do you need to add them? And for most small woodland owners, you probably have a pretty healthy population, but there are some exceptions. We have found that highly eroded land or lands that have been denuded for some periods of time lose a lot of their inoculation potential. A lot of nurseries that use fumigants, lose their mycorrhizal population. If you're dealing with a soilless media or compost that has been sterilized, that knocks out the mycorrhiza. And they don't like a lot of disturbance, and they don't like fallow. So if you took a pasture, for example, and tried to establish a Christmas tree plantation there, you might really struggle early on because ectomycorrhizae aren't there to get the conifers to grow. In fact, that's exactly what we saw back in the old days. I think this is probably 1979. This is Wind River Nursery up in Portland area, but southern Washington. But what they did is they went out and these were basically agricultural lands, and they tried to grow trees, and they got this real uneven growth and very spotty growth. And we have these stunted trees, and they were stunted because these trees, even though there was tons of phosphorus in the ground, they couldn't access the phosphorus without the mycorrhiza. So they grew in a very stunted way. And we saw it in the southeast as well with liquid ambar and many of the pine species that were grown in the southeast part of the United States, where they fumigate or they excessively disturb these soils. They'd knock out their mycorrhizal populations, and they'd have these very stunted trees and this typical purpling pattern, which is a phosphorus deficiency in these liquid ambar trees. My mentor, he's still alive. Jim is 91. This is Jim Trappy from Morgan State University. He pioneered a lot of the mycorrhizal research in the Northwest and North America. And I was in charge of the seedling production for Southwest Oregon. We were growing millions of trees back in the early 80s. And we were having lots of problems with stunting and really poor survival of the trees when they were outplanted. I mean, our survival rate was like a little less than 50%. So the root systems were terrible on these trees. They looked great when they left the nursery, but they just didn't have any feeder roots. So I asked all the experts, what can we do to, improve survival and, get more, have less culls at nurseries. So I called everybody, and the same answer was the same: add more fertilizer. Just crank up the fertilizer. And the problem with that is that it caused a lot of disease problems at the nursery, and a lot of salt problems at the nursery. And the trees were, they would grow well for a while, and then we ended up with these tremendous pathogen problems. And it was just a treadmill that we were spending lots of money, and we really weren't getting survival in the field. So I called Jim at Oregon State University, and he said, "Oh yeah, I go out in the forest and you collect these truffles and puffballs, and you put them in a blender, and you spray them over the seedling beds, and they'll grow normally." And I thought, who is this kook? Who is this guy? Going out in the forest collecting mushrooms to put in a blender and spray over these beds in these nurseries. But I went out and did it because it's pretty desperate, and it worked tremendously. And here is Jim spreading, soil from the forest in the nursery to try and get the mycorrhizal stem established in the forest. And we did it all over the world, really. And it was tremendously successful, using not soil, but spores from fruiting bodies of these fungi to get them established. A lot of fun. Turns out that that small mammals are important in moving fungi around in the forest. This is the flying squirrel, and the truffles put off a pheromone of animal basically in heat, and it attracts small animals to dig up these truffles and eat them. And then as they travel around the forest, in their fecal material, they'll deposit the spores of the truffles they dig up in the forest. And that's the way mycorrhiza spread. Here you can see it's Histrangium spores. You can see a little squirrel eating a truffle. And you've probably seen truffles in the forest in your woodlands and not really known it. A lot of times squirrels will leave them on a stump, or they'll leave them, they'll cache them in the forest to eat later. They sort of dry them, and then they become available later. But for the northern flying squirrel, I think it's about 90% of its diet. They come in at night. I love truffles. We have so many truffles in Southern Oregon. No, they're not the good edible ones like the French black truffle. I'll talk a little bit more about that, and the Italian white truffle. But they're very common. They're more, actually, we did some research, and truffles are more common than mushrooms in much of Southwest Oregon. So they're very common. You've probably seen little spots where the animals have dug little pits in the forest, and a lot of times they're digging up truffles. It's a big part of their diet. These are some of the common ones that we use in forestry that we find in Southwest Oregon. We basically put the spores in bottles and in a blender, and then come up with these super saturated suspensions. And then we would inject them into sprinklers to inoculate trees. Some of the early trials. This is actually the J. Herb Stone Nursery in Southwest Oregon, and we didn't know how much to add, so we try and figure out how many spores to add per seedling, or per lineal foot of bed, or per acre. We did trials all over the place. China, Australia, Costa Rica, Southwest Oregon, Southeast United States. And we'd measure the tree response. And then we started doing, this is cedar, which is an endomycorrhiza. We started using the truffle and puffball data to try and figure out, what would work for endomycorrhizal plants like liquidine bar, like sweet gum, or cedars. Redwoods was another one. And we take these nurseries that had this terrible growth, and we'd inoculate, and we get this tremendous response. It was good. So to document it, a lot of people struggle with trying to visualize what's going on below the ground. And so we grew trees in glass boxes, And here, the tree on the right, you can see the little pine tree was inoculated and then put in the box. You can see all the white threads. And we also were able to trace it, how it would spread from tree to tree in the forest. And kind of interesting to visualize that effect. This is what Rhizopogon looks like. This is a truffle species, very common to our region. And they basically have sort of they're white at the beginning and they'll turn more amber or colored, kind of a light brown color as they mature. Can actually get black when they're very mature. And they come in a variety of colors. They often stain red when they're handled. So if you touch them, they'll have like a red staining. And you can see these strings here are these rhizomorphs, and that's to haul water around the forest. They're really good at drought protection. And then the spores that we collect are actually in these cavities, these little holes inside the gleba are lined with spores. So a typical truffle will have, if it's mature, will have 2 to 3 billion spores in it. So you can inoculate, we use like 10,000 spores per seedling. You can literally inoculate thousands of seedlings with a single truffle. And this is, you can see where it looks like this is the root system of a pine tree. And you can see the white roots that are swollen. And that's actually Rhizopogon. That's from the J. Herbertstone Nursery in Medford. Sometimes we even get truffles in the root containers. See the truffles there? Big pine tree, truffles on the roots. So occasionally we would get a truffle in our production. So these truffles are, you can eat them, but they're not good. But there are some truffles that are really good, some edible truffles. For those that you watch the cooking channel, you probably have heard of the French black truffle or the Italian white truffle. There are several others too that can do that, but they actually are being grown on oak trees in Europe and oak trees and hazelnut trees in places like Australia. This is from Australia, where hazels and oaks were inoculated. And then it took about 5 to 7 years, but we got tremendous truffle production down there. And the nice thing about the truffles from Australia is that they occur in the off season of the Northern Hemisphere truffles. So they're fresh to restaurants when restaurants can't get fresh truffles. But this is what a truffle mycorrhiza looks like on an oak seedling. They're really pretty, swollen little sausages. This is the Italian white truffle. This one's real, it's like $4,000 a pound. They're incredibly expensive. There's a new show out called on Netflix that was about truffles, the truffle hunter. And it's kind of about the Italian white truffle and goes back to the old truffle hunters of Italy. It's pretty interesting, but they're incredibly valuable. They use dogs and pigs to find them. But we have many important ectomycorrhizal fruiting bodies. Like you've seen this thing everywhere. It's called Pisolithus tinctorius, dead man's foot. It's very prolific in our area. There's been a lot of studies on PT, we call it Pisolithus tinctorius. And it occurs, you find the fruiting bodies around roadsides, but these spores are very effective for producing mycorrhizal fungi. So it looks like when it's developing. A lot of kids will pick these and throw them at each other just to create a mess. Lacaria is another one. Lacaria can be grown as a vegetative mycelium and you can get fruiting bodies, but you can also collect it. And the spores are actually on the gills beneath the caps. That's how you use it. Here's the Lacaria, the gills. Nice picture. Here's some beds at the Stone Nursery. They were inoculated with Lacaria. You can see all all the Licarian mushrooms fruiting along the beds. And the Licarian container. Another good one that's actually really good to eat is Boletus edulis, the king bolete. And it has like a sponge cap underneath the top. You've seen Sewillis in your forest. Probably all of you have booted some Sewillis in your woodlands. They're very common. But the porcini is a bolete, which is a close relative of Sewillis. And they're delicious. They're delicious to eat, and an important mycorrhizal fungus. This is Sewillis, which is, they call it slippery jack. That's what it looks like on the roots. This is one you've seen too, scleroderma. It's got like a shell-like covering, and then inside is the fertile tissue that's got the spores. And that's one that's really good for drought protection, like rhizopogons. Good fungus, really pretty root. So the benefits, I mean, we found the benefits in the nursery are, you can see the seedlings on the left were treated. You could grow seedlings with less fertilizer because the fertilizer is better utilized. They survive a lot better in the field. They grow better with less care. One on the left was treated. And then here's looking at a root, you can see the mantle covering the root of the sock, and then you can see the radiating mycorrhizal hyphae in the soil. And they're basically the roots of the roots. They're doing the active uptake of nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, potassium, and the micronutrients. You also can get amino acids out of decomposing organic matter. So here you can see a little pine tree growing, and then we actually accidentally put some needles in the box, and you can see where the mycorrhizal fungi are going after the needles to recycle the amino acids in the needles themselves. So they can get at organic forms of nitrogen, which is really important in terms of tree growth. This is the Gulf of Mexico. The red areas are called, it's called a hypoxia zone. It's really bad this last year. All the nutrients from the Corn Belt go down the Mississippi River, and they flow out into the Mississippi Delta and then into the Gulf of Mexico. But all those nutrients cause blooms of algae. 1 pound of phosphorus in the Gulf produces 250 pounds of algae. So it's a real problem. When the algae decomposes, it takes all the oxygen out of the water, causes you smash fish die-offs, etc. So the old idea about using mycorrhizal fungi in our management practices is to minimize the movement of nutrients into streams, into rivers, lakes, groundwater, etc. So the plant captures it before it gets into water where it causes devastation. Algae's winning the war.
Agriculture.
We can actually. So this is a view of the web. This is a root tip. You can see it's coated with fungi. Again, this is a well-colonized root. You can see there's very little root in a lot of the blue area, which is the mycorrhiza. It's important to use mycorrhiza in agriculture and forestry because of the ability of the mycorrhizal fungi to put carbon in the soil. The mycorrhizal fungi produce clomalin, which is a carbon compound that leaves a residue of carbon in the soil. So a mycorrhizal system can add 1,000 pounds of carbon per acre per year into the soil. So it's a huge way to get carbon out of the atmosphere where it does damage in terms of global warming and get it into the soil where it's stored. It actually benefits plant growth. This is the Rodale Institute, which did a 20-year study of organic methods with mycorrhiza versus conventional methods of growing food. And you can see the soil on the right has much higher organic matter contents. And that's carbon. So the small woodlands success story. You guys tend to understand your land and its needs, its ability to survive and grow and stay healthy. I've never really talked to woodland owners that didn't have a good feel for their own properties. I think it's a real success story, and it's real opportunity for people to provide a lot of resources and also store a lot of carbon in the soil and create a lot of habitat. So what's happening with mycorrhiza? I retired from our company, Mycorrhizal Applications, in 2015. They're still going strong. A lot of nurseries use mycorrhiza. I think in Grants Pass, the mycorrhizal inoculum that we produce goes to over 40 different countries. It's getting really important in organic agriculture, specialty crops. It's getting a lot cost effective, and it eliminates the use of a lot of fossil fuels because you don't need as much fertilizer and water to grow plants. So it's very cost effective. We've worked on all kinds of crazy projects all over the world. We did Olympic Games. This is the Wynn Hotel in Las Vegas, trying to get these pine trees to establish in these very droughty, very disturbed environments. And getting mycorrhiza into the soil is a big part of the success of those plantings. And I think this visual says it all. We want to produce plants that have these elaborate root systems which can better access resources in the soil. I've been doing this a long time. So where I started, I was producing inoculum in my garage for studies with the Forest Service and with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I used to do it out of my garage, and those were fun days. People thought we were crazy, but it turns out that we had some good insights, and it's not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet that's going to solve all your problems, but it does help plants grow. Things could be worse with this COVID situation. Things could be worse. Hopefully we'll see the light at the end of the tunnel on this COVID, and we can get back to work and get back to manage the land and being around each other, etc. I just want to thank you. Happy to answer any questions that I could. But if you look at, like, say, a redwood stand, for example, this is from Crescent City area. These trees are 250 feet tall or 8 foot in diameter, 300 years old, and they've never been fertilized, they've never been irrigated. They have in these soils a remarkable ability for them to adapt, to change, and to maintain their health. So that's the kind, it's really the root systems which are the guiding light for the health of these systems. So I think for small woodland owners, to have healthy soil that's not compacted, not eroded, that you maintain the biological component, we can maintain the health of these systems by using what nature has provided. And with that, I will be quiet and turn it back over to Jerry and answer any questions.
Well, we do have some questions. Earlier, David Rudkin had a question. David, are you still there? You can unmute yourself and ask the question. Otherwise, I'll start in on the chat questions. Let me go ahead and do that. Alex asks, how big does the fruit get?
How big does the fruit get?
Yeah, probably like the truffles or the...
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. So a typical truffle will be, a really large truffle is probably the size of a golf ball. In many cases, they're half or a quarter that size. So they can be anywhere from, the size of a dime to the size of a golf ball. Occasionally we get the Rhizopogon colossus will get to be the size of a softball, but that's pretty rare. So, they're visual. You can smell them if you dig them out of the woods. They smell, sometimes they smell fruity. Sometimes some of them smell like diesel. There's truffles in Australia that smell like bubble gum. They have a variety of scents. They're usually pretty fragrant. So they're easy to find. Just look where squirrels have dug.
Thank you. Georgia Rojas would like to know more about applying mycorrhiza to crops. You mentioned a couple of things.
Well, it's a big deal for agriculture because, agriculture produces about 30% of our greenhouse gases. And so we could turn agriculture into something that is doing a lot of damage to the environment to something that's very regenerative to the environment. And we could turn agriculture around till we could store a lot of carbon by using certain methods in agriculture to actually store carbon in the soil. Because in America, we've got over 200 million acres of farmland. So if each of those acres was sequestering 1,000 acres of carbon per acre per year, that's almost our whole carbon emissions for the country, for USA. So it's a big deal. We've written several papers on the opportunity, and I get another paper coming out next month. So it's a tremendous opportunity. The way to do that in agriculture is to do it early in the growth cycle. So typically a farmer would ban the mycorrhizal inoculum next to the seed in the planting hole. That's probably the most efficient. The cost is about $10 to $15 per acre at current rates of mycorrhizal inoculum. So it's not incidental, but it's also not super expensive to add mycorrhiza. And then farmers can often use less fertilizer and water, which saves them some money and get better yields. So it's catching on. I mean, it's still probably, in places like India, it's probably 10% of the market is inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi. There's some places in Europe where it's higher than that. In the United States, it's probably more like 1 or 2%. Organic farms are doing it more frequently. So it's increasing, but it's still not a dominant practice.
Thank you. Danny Barnes would like to know if you could tell us how to gather native mycorrhizae, culture it, and inoculate the soil ourselves.
Well, for trees, it's really easy. Go out in the woods. And usually the fall is a good time to collect fungi. And the best ones are slippery jacks, the Suillus, puffballs like sclerodermas, and that PT, that thing. So if you got David Aurora's book, All the Rain Promises and More, he's got a great guide to a lot of the common mycorrhizal fungal fruiting bodies that occur in Southwest Oregon. All the Rain Promises and More by David Aurora. It's a little pocket guide, and you'll learn a lot about fungi. And there's probably 20 or 30 in there that would be valuable to inoculate. And then you just water them into the soil. So the whole option, when the roots are active, you just basically take a slurry of these fruiting bodies and just water them in the soil. And you'll see the white threads, the brown threads growing in the soil in response to adding the fungi. It's not rocket science.
Danny was also interested in knowing if the spores are damaged by UV light.
No. They have a lot of pigment in them. This was a popular misconception. I don't know where this started, this ultraviolet lights. A lot of the spores are naturally, for millions of years, have been blown around in the wind and landed on the soil surface and exposed to UV light. And they do just fine. They have pigments in them that protect them from UV light. This has been around since I've been working with mycorrhiza, and there's really no data to indicate that ultraviolet light affects the viability of spores.
A shout out from Lori Stoll saying that there are great edible truffles found in Oregon, and check out the Oregon Truffle Festival.
Been there.
Yeah.
There are. But if you just randomly went out and got a truffle, chances of finding a good edible like the Oregon white truffle or balsamia, chances of just finding one without knowing, the taxonomy of these things is quite small. My son actually grows truffle trees. He grows oaks and things, but it's a long term. You have to commit to it for years. You need a dog to get them. So it's not easy to, grow edible truffles. You have to be quite dedicated and have the right kind of land, the right management. You have to add calcium and lime to your soil and monitor that. So it's not that easy. But yeah, I mean, I eat fungi almost every day, and I've collected a lot of the Oregon white truffle from the coast. And it's okay, but when it's immature, it's really not very good. You got to make sure that you get like mature specimens that have the fragrance and the aroma. And sometimes collectors just want to get them, and they're not waiting until they're mature where they're really, good from a culinary standpoint. So we do have some good edible truffles in Oregon, but a lot of times they're immature.
Great. I think you already answered the textbook question. Scott Good was just wondering if there are any other texts that cover the topics that you're presenting.
Let's see here. I've got a whole library of books here. I'll show you some of the ones that I like. I forget David Orr's big book. I'm back. So this is what David Aurora's little pocket guide looks like. It's fantastic for our area. He's a real fun guy. And he's a lot of the collections that he got from around here. So really, this guide really works great for our area, and it's pretty inexpensive. Here's this more thick taxonomic dive into all the fungi. So this would be all the fungi in the Western US. And it's a lot more detailed. It's got a lot more taxonomy stuff, but it's a good guide for the real avid collector. And then just to know more about mycorrhiza, this Mycorrhizal Planet book is fantastic. This guy really knows how to communicate the value of mycorrhiza and how just small farms and organic farms and woodlands can utilize mycorrhizae. And if you're just interested in the edible stuff, this is a great book too. It's actually from Europe, but the pictures are outstanding and the descriptions are outstanding. So if you're just looking to eat mushrooms, this is a great book. It's called Safe to Pick and Good to Eat, Edible Mushrooms. So those are all excellent resources for the person that wants to learn more about fungi. Southern Oregon is unbelievable for fungi. I mean, if it ever rains again, but I mean, it is. I mean, you go to places like either side of Mount McLaughlin or Lake of the Woods, you go to the coast, you go up to Bandon area, Crescent City. I mean, there's some incredible places to collect mushrooms here. Yeah, it's fun. Yeah, in the woods. A lot of times I've been doing it for 40 years. I see stuff that I've never seen before, stuff that I can't identify, but be safe, just don't eat things. Oh, you have to absolutely know it before you eat it. So.
Great. Joyce Mills would like to know if there is a list available of the fungi and the individual tree species that they're associated with.
Mycorrhiza, we did that for mycorrhizal applications. So if you went to the mycorrhizal applications website, they probably have a really, really good list of plant fungi compatibility things. A lot of the ones that I mentioned will work on most all trees in Southwest Oregon, so you don't need to be specific, but there is some specificity out there, but in most cases if you collect the fungi from those particular stands, they would work for inoculating trees in those stands. And for the endomycorrhiza, like the important agricultural plants, that's a little trickier. It's actually probably less work and less hassle to just buy some inoculum and put it in with your seedlings or your planting or your seed to get the mycorrhiza established, because it's a lot more technical to collect and move endomycorrhiza for agricultural plants and for some horticulture.
Yeah, I've seen those products at the Grange. Actually, that's Annette Parsons' question, wanting to know about available products that she can put on a field that she's trying to rehab. It's a non-irrigated pasture. She wants to know where to get it and how much to apply per acre.
If you have a small amounts, there's a site called Mycorrhiza Online. They can get like 1, 5, or 10 pound packages. If you have larger areas, mycorrhizal application, I mean, they produce 1 million pounds a year. So that's a good source. That's in Grants Pass. Both those companies are in Grants Pass. There are, for the cannabis industry, there's all kinds of crazy companies out there producing mycorrhiza for cannabis. Some are good. I don't keep track of it anymore. There's like several dozen of them. And some of them are good, but some of them are just, I don't know what they're selling. Fairy dust. So, beware of some of the cannabis sites for mycorrhizal inoculum, because in my experience, it hasn't been that great. But both Mycorrhiza Online and mycorrhizal applications are Grants Pass. And they have proven technologies, and they've done a lot of, mycorrhizal applications does about $2 to $3 million worth of field studies every year. So they're really doing a lot of good, sound science surrounding mycorrhiza. So they're a trusted partner.
Adam Johnson would like to know if there's a brand of mycorrhiza soil that you'd recommend for growing microgreens and other vegetables.
Yeah, there's some soils available. I know, can't remember all the companies, but in Eureka, like Fox Farm has a mycorrhizal soil that's been, Dr. Earth has a mycorrhizal soil. I've used a lot of that very successfully. So for, containerized situations where you're dealing with, bagged soils, both Fox Farm and Dr. Earth, I think, have been very, well tested, and they've been around for 20, 25 years. So they have some success under their belt.
Kent Knock says there must be bacteria and other organisms in the soil near the roots that interact with the fungi. Is there any data on that?
There is, and there's more coming. As it turns out, it's a lot of these effects are, mycorrhiza are keystone species, but there's nitrogen fixing bacteria, free living nitrogen bacteria. There's these biofilms that help maintain soil structure. It's pretty complicated. There's lots of organisms in the soil that are, so if you're adding like compost, you're adding all of these really other valuable biological substrates to your soil. So a lot of times when you use some of these other organic amendments, anything with carbon in it, kelp, compost, another really good one is a biochar. You're adding a lot of microorganisms when you add that to your system. So anything that's carbon based, it's not like a chemical, quick release fertilizer, which actually harms a lot of these beneficial organisms. You want slow release forms of nutrients, more natural based nutrient additions.
Great. Adam asked you to repeat the book title, All the Blank and More.
Okay. And I'll show you a picture of it. All the Rain Promises and More by David Aurora. See that, David Aurora. And like I said, a lot of his collections actually came from Southern Oregon. So, he's quite familiar with our species. And he's kind of a character. It's a very delightful book. He's got lots of stories and he makes it very entertaining. It's a great pocket guide. There's very few things that in the forest that you'll find that you can't key out in this book for Southern Oregon. So David needs to send me a royalty or something because I'm pushing his book pretty hard.
Danny Barnes does nature restoration in disturbed urban areas. He cultivates mycorrhiza and applies it as a slurry. He wants to know, is inoculation generally a one-time process or should slurry be applied annually?
That's a good question. And generally, if the inoculum levels are high enough with the first application and you get it established in the soil, it'll stay there as long as there's green cover. Because the mycorrhiza depend on the plant to provide the energy to survive and grow. So as long as you don't have a fallow period or some kind of non-vegetated period, it should stay in the soil and continue to grow and propagate. So you only should need one application. What I have found though is that in some applications, they're really not using enough mycorrhizae, so they need to reapply to get sufficient inoculum loads to really get the mycorrhizal effect. So, I mean, if you're using it a lot in your first application, usually one application is enough. But if you're trying to inoculate 40 acres with 4 pounds of material, it's tough to get enough inoculum out there without having several applications.
Cheyenne is a former USDA employee wondering if you might have some insight into why NRCS hasn't yet adopted mycelium banding on cropland as a conservation practice. Is the science too new? As an NRCS employee myself, hoping to bring some of this information to the forefront.
They're making progress. I don't know if you've seen Kiss the Ground, the Netflix show. It's an NRCS help sponsor it. It's watch Kiss the Ground on Netflix. It's spectacular. It's about the biology of the soil and the ability of the soil to sequester carbon. It's got a heavy NRCS influence. There is quite a group in the NRCS that are very pro mycorrhiza. So it's happening. It's coming from the ground, the people in the field, and not so much from the people in the upper echelons in the NRCS. So it's happening. I mean, they're pretty supportive generally. The government, most discoveries, most technologies, takes 30 to 40 years for them to be really adapted. That's just the kind of the nature of agriculture. Is very conservative. You know, they like pouring fertilizer. I mean, I've seen so much fertilizer added on fields. Like, why are we doing this? You know, it's just overkill. You know, if 80 pounds of nitrogen is good, let's put 160 on because it's cheap. But it does a lot of damage to the surrounding area. So, you know, it just takes a while to change people's mindsets. You know, the Green Revolution really had a lot of negative effects in terms of the environment and its effects on water quality and soil salinity and reducing organic matter content of soils and excessive tilling. There's been a lot of negative effects to conventional ag. So NRCS is all part of that system. You know, they're all part of that. It's going to be slow to change, but there are quite a few people. Watch Kiss the Ground. It's fantastic. It'll get you fired up.
Michael wants to know what fungus can grow in an arid zone.
Well, all desert plants, pretty much all desert plants are mycorrhizal. So they're mostly endomycorrhizal species. I'm not aware of any desert plants that aren't mycorrhizal. They obviously require them for drought protection and protection against extremes of environment. So, but they're all endomycorrhiza. They're not ecto, so they're not like the puffballs or the or the mushrooms or the truffles. They produce individual inoculum, and a lot of times the inoculum is, you can purchase it as sort of, looks like kitty litter like thing, so you have to put it in there. So that way.
Adam is dropping another fungus researcher name that's actually presented at the Jackson Josephine Small Woodlands Association Tree School a few years ago, Paul Stamets. And he's wondering if you know him or any of the interesting work that he's doing with fungi.
Paul and I go back like to the early 80s, and we assisted in the production of his home and garden products. So for 20 years, we were the mycorrhizal source for some of the products that he had, his microgrow products. So Paul and I go way back. I mean, he spent a lot of time in Southern Oregon, so we have a long history. He's been really great for, fungi lovers because he's so passionate about it. He's super knowledgeable. So I'm not surprised that Paul has not turned on probably millions of people. I know his TED Talks got a lot of people excited. So I have a lot of respect for Paul. He's kind of the Carl Sagan of our field.
Lynn wants to know how to use mycorrhiza with home vegetable and flower gardens.
Well, if you're transplanting seedlings, you would just put like a teaspoon in with each seedling you transplant, or you can mix it with your soilless media if you're, doing raised beds, or you can coat seeds with powder. So if you're growing from seed, basically put the seed in a bag and take the mycorrhizal powder and shake it up and then plant the seed. So it really depends on how you're planting. All three of those methods I think are effective because you put the mycorrhiza in where the roots are growing. So I would think that any one of those methods would work. What happens in a forestry situation is they'll often spray it on and then leach the spores into the soil. So that works if your soils are porous enough to allow the spores to filter down into the root zone.
Adam says that he's heard that some fungi can break down plastics that otherwise would take centuries to break down. And he's wondering if you could say anything about the use of fungi for breaking down plastics.
Yeah, they're pleurotus. They're the white rock fungi. And they can actually be, you're gonna think I'm crazy, but they've actually trained these fungi to break down plastics and break down like cigarette butts, all these things that they have. There's fungi products to break down petroleum products like in oil spills, but they're not the mycorrhizal ones. They tend to be the white rot fungi, and they produce strong chemicals that take these toxic chemicals and break them down into smaller pieces so they can be processed into non-harmful chemicals. So yeah, there's a lot of that going on. They tend to be like angel wing fungi, reishi, ganoderma, turkey tail are some of the ones that they've used. And they actually train them. So they'll take cultures, they'll take 20 cultures, and they'll grow them with, say, cigarette butts, or they'll grow them with a chemical with a petroleum product. And of those 20, one will kind of grow a little bit into the petroleum product. So they isolate that one, they grow it again, grows a little better in petroleum products. They pick that one isolate that does that. And so they sort of train it over time, and they can do this. And after several years, they'll find one that's really aggressive on petroleum products. And then they grow it in bulk. Often it's on nutrient, like on sawdust with nutrient solution, and then they'll broadcast it across the spill area to break down petroleum products. That's actually being used all over. It's bioremediation. It's getting very common. It's probably a $1 billion industry globally.
Denny has a recipe. He buries cooked rice in pantyhose, plants it shallowly among the roots of targeted tree species, And then he has it cultivate in a solution of water and molasses for a month or so, and wants to know if that's a good method, or do you find that grinding up the fruiting bodies and making a slurry of that more effective?
Well, for saprophytic fungi, for decomposers, his method seems like it'd be a really good method. But for mycorrhizal fungi, probably not, because they need an energy source to grow and survive, and molasses is not an energy source for mycorrhizal fungi. So that would be good for saprophytic fungi. So if you want to get some decomposition going out there, that's probably a good technique, but not a good technique for mycorrhizal fungi.
Okay. I think you answered Scott's question about once established, does the mycopopulation persist as long as there's a crop available?
Yeah, as long as there's living plants, it should grow and survive and even become more vigorous over time. So, I mean, if you go out into a redwood stand, oh my God, it's just crazy the amount of fungi going on out there. It's like 10,000 species in a tablespoon. You know, it's just crazy. There's just so much activity. So, you know, there's trees that have been grown in the same place for a long time, supplying energy below ground. And so there's no shortage of diversity or abundance of mycorrhizal fungi or really any fungi. But once you create a fallow situation where all the plants are gone, you lose all that energy source for not only mycorrhizal fungi, but for a lot of the process going on below the ground.
You're getting kudos from Kathy Pendergrass. Thanks for sharing your expertise. From Annette Parsons, a retired soil scientist from the United States Forestry Service and BLM. Very honored to hear your presentation. And from Kent Knock, thanking you for the presentation. The next question is from Adam. Do you know if ProMix is a good brand of mycorrhizal soil?
I think that's produced by the Premier in Canada. And they have a high quality inoculum. I'm not quite sure they're adding enough. I think it's 1 spore per cubic foot of soil. So, I mean, that's not really enough to do anything. So, I mean, you need to really check the label. If it's that dilute in your soil, to call it a mycorrhizal soil is probably not accurate, you know. So you need to have, you know, you should have several hundred propagules per cubic foot of soil to be effective. So if they're only having 1 per cubic yard, that's really not enough to make a difference. So, you know, it's just like anything, you got to read the label and make sure you're getting a quality product. I know that the basic mycorrhiza that they produce up there at Premier, that ProMix, if you just look at this, their concentrate, it's fantastic. The problem is they're not adding enough into their soil. I think that's my view of their situation.
Michael wants to know, does the fungus survive wildfires?
Interesting, because I was part of my PhD work way back in the Ice Age when dinosaurs roamed Southern Oregon. We looked at the effects of wildfire on mycorrhizal populations, and if it's like a really low intensity fire, the answer is yes. If it's a high intensity stand replacement fire, the answer is probably no. In some situations, even in a high intensity fire, the mycorrhiza comes up from the bottom and will eventually colonize the seedlings as they start to produce. In a lot of cases, like the sprouting madrone and manzanita will protect those populations of mycorrhizal fungi, but the high intensity fire, it has been a problem. That's probably a good time to inoculate, but low intensity fire, don't worry about it. It only goes down a couple inches and it moves up from the bottom.
Okay, I think coming up next is my favorite question of the night. Adam says, in another OSU mycology presentation, the presenter said that fungi is a conscious organism. Do you agree? Is there any scientific basis for that claim?
I don't know the answer to that. I would think that the fungi do communicate below ground. There's all kinds of data where they will warn, one plant will warn another plant of an insect attack or a pathogen attack via the link to mycorrhizal fungi. So I think that's pretty well established in literature. The whole mother tree helping the baby trees grow in the forest is a pretty anthropomorphic approach to forestry. And, I'm not sure if we need to do that, but certainly there's communication below ground. There is communication, but whether it's intelligent communication, I don't know. What's your definition of intelligence? I'm not sure what that is, but there certainly is communication going on below the ground. So that I would agree that is the scientific, proved at this point.
Great. Kent wants to know if there are any fungi that associate with ferns.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think they form endomycorrhiza, but they're weird because they, I just don't know the answer to that. I know they're probably endo, and I've seen some in my career on endo, but I wouldn't know which kind of endo or if all ferns are endomycorrhizal or not. They're very primitive. They may be one of the few plant species that were here about the same time that mycorrhiza developed. So that's a good question.
So that was the last question. So I'll go ahead and ask a question. I was telling Mike before the presentation, I'm a biology teacher in town. And for years, my freshman biology class has been using mycorrhiza in a long-term experiment. And we raise a number of mostly weedy plants, from seeds. And some of them we inoculate with myco, and half of them we don't. And then they have a second independent variable to see if there's any interaction. And one of the things that we've noticed, we talk about symbiosis in the class. And one of the things that we notice is in conditions that are very harsh for the plants, like drought conditions, we purposefully grow some of the plants with very little water, or we grow the plants in very poor soils or sand. Those are the conditions where the plants with mycorrhiza do better. But we've also noticed that plants that grow in with all of their conditions met, like in potting soil with plenty of water, the plants don't do well. And I'm wondering if in good conditions, if mycorrhiza in the soil could actually act as a parasite. It's stealing food from the plants, but it's not giving the plants anything because they have all their needs met.
Well, it's very possible that under ideal conditions, the mycorrhizae aren't even forming on those plants.
Oh,
You'd have to do an assessment. So it's
Yeah.
quite likely that those plants that are heavily watered, heavily fertilized in ideal conditions aren't even forming mycorrhiza. So it's not a mycorrhiza negative effect or positive effect. It's probably maybe just too much water or too much nutrients, too much salt or whatever.
mhm.
But I think you're absolutely right. Without question that the mycorrhizal benefits are more prominent in any kind of rigorous conditions. So if there's drought, if there's any kind of nutrient deficiencies, you've got harsh conditions in terms of the environment, that's really when you see the benefits. Or if phosphorus is unavailable, that's kind of the, Jerry, if phosphorus is unavailable, phosphorus is like a little rock in the soil. So it takes the enzyme of the mycorrhiza to dissolve the phosphorus and calcium phosphate, which looks like a little rock in the soil. So it's got to dissolve that. Iron is another one that's like a little rock in the soil, so you have to dissolve that. So if you don't have, if you're adding soluble nutrients, mycorrhiza don't even germinate. The spores never even, because it's like they're not needed. They don't even, the plant puts out a little signal for the spores to germinate. So in the absence of the need for mycorrhiza, they don't put off the chemical that causes the spores to even germinate and grow.
Okay. I see I missed a question from Michael Pond. I saw it earlier. Michael is from Grants Pass, an old timer, and he wants to give a shout out, but I didn't understand what you wrote. Could you please retype it? Or you could even unmute yourself and just ask it specifically. Michael, if you could ask your question again. We'll give him a chance. Are you there, Michael? Well, that may be it. I don't see any further questions. My apologies to Michael. I didn't understand what you had typed in the chat. Does anybody else have any other questions? We've got some more thank yous for fascinating, enlightening presentation from Janet. It was a great talk tonight, Mike. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jerry. Appreciate it. Keep up the good work out there, people. Stay safe.
Good night, everybody.
Night. Jerry, good job.
Hey, thank you.
Wow. I'm glad